The rain had soaked everything that day, every sidewalk, every leaf, every hopeful heart, except for the millionaire's mansion, where silence reigned like an unyielding storm. In that vast, cold house, a single clock ticked without soul, its hands frozen at exactly 2:17 p.m. He always had time, they whispered in the city, but time had never been kind to him. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're looking at an old photograph or remembering something you lost long ago. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your soul. In the heart of Chicago's affluent Gold Coast, where Lake Michigan's steel-gray waters reflected the architectural giants of a city built on ambition, Henry Caldwell stood as a monument to American success. His penthouse office on the 52nd floor of the Caldwell Tower commanded views that stretched beyond the horizon, where cargo ships moved like distant memories across the lake. Below him, the city pulsed with the rhythm of commerce and dreams, while Henry remained untouchable in his glass sanctuary. At 43, Henry possessed a fortune that most could only imagine in their wildest dreams. His investment portfolio spanned continents, tech stocks that had multiplied like prayers answered, real estate holdings that stretched from the Magnificent Mile to Silicon Valley, cryptocurrency assets that included enough Bitcoin to fund a small nation's budget. Financial magazines featured his face on covers, calling him the king of digital gold, the man who had transformed a modest software startup into a multi-billion-dollar empire. His net worth, calculated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, continued to grow even as he slept, dividends and interest payments flowing into his accounts like an unstoppable river of wealth. Yet, for all his material abundance, Henry's world had become a mausoleum of marble and mahogany. His Lincoln Park mansion, a sprawling testament to architectural excellence, felt more like a tomb than a home. The rooms, decorated by the city's most expensive interior designers, remained largely untouched, pristine spaces where footsteps echoed against polished floors and shadows danced across silk wallpaper. Persian rugs worth more than most people's annual salaries lay beneath furniture that no one sat upon. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across dining tables where no meals were shared, where no laughter had been heard for far too long. The house held 23 clocks, each one deliberately stopped at 2:17 p.m., the exact moment when Henry's world had shattered 5 years earlier. That Tuesday afternoon, when his wife Sarah and their 7-year-old daughter Emma had left for Emma's piano lesson, the clocks had been ticking normally. By evening, they had become monuments to the last moment of his complete happiness. The car accident on Lakeshore Drive had been instantaneous, the police had assured him. They hadn't suffered. But Henry had been suffering ever since, carrying the weight of a phone call he hadn't answered, a goodbye kiss he hadn't given, and words of love that would forever remain unspoken. The morning ritual was always the same. Henry would wake at 5:30 a.m. in his king-sized bed, surrounded by Egyptian cotton sheets that provided no comfort. He would walk past Emma's room, its door perpetually closed, past the master bedroom he had shared with Sarah, now converted into a sterile office space. In the kitchen, he would pour himself coffee from a machine that cost more than most people's cars, and he would read financial reports on his tablet while standing at the Marble Island, never sitting, never settling, always ready to escape the silence that threatened to swallow him whole. His housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, would arrive at 7, moving through the mansion like a ghost herself, dusting surfaces that gleamed with disuse, polishing silver that would never grace a dinner party, arranging flowers in vases that stood like sentinels in empty rooms. She had learned not to speak unless spoken to, understanding that her employer preferred the cushion of silence to the sharp edges of conversation. The only sounds in the house were the whisper of her cleaning supplies, the soft hum of expensive appliances, and the occasional creak of the massive structure settling into itself, like a giant slowly collapsing under its own weight. The walls displayed no photographs of happier times. Henry had removed them all, unable to bear the sight of Sarah's radiant smile or Emma's gap-toothed grin. Instead, abstract paintings hung in their place, expensive pieces that spoke of nothing, meant nothing, felt nothing. They were investments, he told himself, assets that would appreciate over time, though he cared nothing for their monetary value or their artistic merit. They simply filled space where memories might otherwise intrude. On this particular gray October morning, as autumn rain pelted Chicago's streets and the lake churned with restless energy, Henry stood at his office window, watching the city below struggle against the storm. His reflection in the glass showed a man who had aged beyond his years, silver threading through dark hair, lines etched deep around eyes that had forgotten how to crinkle with laughter. His expensive Italian suits hung perfectly on a frame that had grown lean from forgotten meals and restless nights. He was a man who had everything money could buy and nothing that money could not purchase. The intercom on his mahogany desk buzzed with the voice of his assistant. "Mr. Caldwell, the board meeting has been moved to 3 o'clock. Also, your accountant called about the quarterly tax estimates and the new cryptocurrency investments you wanted to discuss." Henry nodded to himself, though no one could see him. These were the rhythms that kept him moving forward. Meetings and mergers, acquisitions and assets, the endless dance of capital that had once excited him, but now served merely as a distraction from the hollow echo of his own heartbeat. He had built an empire, but he ruled over ruins. In Chicago's near West Side, where the smell of fresh bread from local bakeries mixed with the exhaust of city buses and the distant sounds of children playing in Humboldt Park, the world painted itself in entirely different colors. Here, storefront churches stood alongside corner groceries, their windows displaying hand-painted signs in both English and Spanish. Murals decorated the sides of buildings, telling stories of struggle and hope, of families who had traveled great distances to plant new roots in American soil. In a modest two-bedroom apartment above Senora Martinez's panaderia, where the scent of fresh conchas and café de olla drifted up through the floorboards like daily prayers, lived a boy who carried light in his pocket. Mateo Ramirez was 9 years old, though his eyes held the ancient wisdom of someone who had learned early that life could be both cruel and beautiful, often within the same moment. His mother, Rosa, worked double shifts at the University of Chicago Medical Center, cleaning floors that gleamed under fluorescent lights while doctors and nurses hurried past her as if she were invisible. Mateo's world was small but rich with texture and warmth. His bedroom walls, painted pale yellow by Rosa's careful hands, displayed his own artwork, crayon drawings of families holding hands, rainbow-colored birds soaring over stick-figure houses, and always pictures of children helping other children. His bed, a twin mattress and box spring that Rosa had bought second-hand from a church sale, was covered with a quilt that his grandmother had made before she passed away, each square telling a story of their family's journey from Guadalajara to Chicago. Every morning, Mateo would wake to the sound of Rosa preparing for her early shift, her movements careful and quiet in the tiny kitchen where they shared breakfast at a table barely large enough for two. She would pack him a lunch of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, an apple if they were lucky, and a juice box that he would often save to share with someone who had less. Before leaving for school, he would kiss his mother's forehead and whisper, "Que Dios te bendiga, Mami," a blessing she had taught him to give freely to those he loved. The walk to St. Augustine Elementary School took Mateo through neighborhoods where languages blended like watercolors in rain, where elderly men played dominoes outside corner stores, and women hung laundry on lines stretched between fire escapes. He would stop to help Mrs. Chen carry her groceries, or to pet Mr. Johnson's old dog who waited patiently outside the barbershop every morning. These small acts of kindness were as natural to Mateo as breathing, gestures he performed without thought of recognition or reward. At school, where the classrooms smelled of chalk dust and the hopes of first-generation American children, Mateo was known for his gentleness. Teachers noticed how he would share his lunch with classmates who had forgotten theirs, how he would sit with the lonely child at recess, how he would help struggling students with their homework without being asked. His English was perfect, tinged with the slight accent he had inherited from Rosa, but his kindness spoke a language that transcended words. After school, while other children ran home to video games and afternoon snacks, Mateo would often linger in the neighborhood, drawn to places where help was needed. He would read to elderly residents at the community center, his young voice bringing stories to eyes dimmed by age and loneliness. He would help sort donations at the food pantry, his small hands carefully organizing cans and boxes with the precision of someone who understood the value of every meal. On this rain-soaked afternoon, as storm clouds gathered over Chicago like gray wool blankets, Mateo was walking home from school when he heard the crying. The sound came from near the bus stop at the corner of Augusta and California, where people waited under insufficient shelter, their umbrellas fighting against wind that seemed determined to turn them inside out. Most commuters huddled in their own concerns, checking phones or staring at the street with the glazed expression of those eager to reach home. But Mateo heard the crying clearly, the distressed wails of infants caught in the storm. He saw them immediately, twin babies, perhaps 6 months old, strapped into a double stroller that had been left near the bus stop's bench. They were soaked from the rain that had blown sideways under the minimal overhang, their little faces red with cold and fear. Their cries were the desperate sounds of vulnerability, of beings too young to understand why they had been abandoned to the elements. Without hesitation, Mateo approached the stroller. The babies wore matching blue onesies, now darkened with rainwater, and their tiny fists waved frantically in the air as they screamed. No parent was visible anywhere in the immediate vicinity. Perhaps someone had stepped away for just a moment, or perhaps these children had been left deliberately. A thought that made Mateo's heart ache with recognition of a cruelty he was too young to fully comprehend, but old enough to feel deeply. He looked around desperately for something to shield them from the rain. His own jacket, thin and already soaked through, wouldn't provide much protection, but he began to remove it anyway. Then he noticed a large piece of cardboard that had blown against the bus stop from some nearby construction work. Moving quickly, Mateo positioned himself between the babies and the wind, using his small body as a windbreak while he carefully maneuvered the cardboard to create a makeshift shelter over the stroller. The babies' cries began to quiet as the rain stopped hitting their faces. Mateo leaned down, his voice soft and melodic, as he began to sing a lullaby that Rosa had sung to him when he was small. Duérmete mi niño, duérmete mi sol. Duérmete pedazo de mi corazón. The Spanish words flowed like honey, and amazingly, the infants began to settle, their cries diminishing to occasional sniffles as they stared up at this strange boy who had appeared like an angel in the storm. For 20 minutes, Mateo stood guard over the twins, singing softly, adjusting the cardboard when the wind threatened to tear it away, wiping rainwater from their faces with the dry interior of his jacket. Cars splashed through puddles nearby, their occupants focused on their own destinations, most never noticing the small drama playing out at the bus stop. But one person noticed. Henry Caldwell had left his office early, unusual for him, driven by a restlessness that often overtook him on gray afternoons when the weight of his empty mansion felt particularly oppressive. He was driving his black Mercedes-Benz S-Class through the West Side, taking a route that would normally never bring him to this neighborhood when traffic forced him to stop at the intersection. Through his rain-streaked windshield, he saw a sight that made him lean forward with sudden attention. A small boy, completely soaked, standing over a baby stroller in the pouring rain, his thin arms struggling to hold a piece of cardboard against the wind. The scene struck Henry with unexpected force. The boy's dedication, his obvious discomfort, his gentle ministrations to children who were clearly not his own. It was a display of selflessness that Henry hadn't witnessed in years. In his world of board meetings and financial maneuvering, where every action had a calculated motive, where kindness was often a strategic decision designed to produce favorable outcomes, this child's behavior seemed to come from a different universe entirely. As Henry watched, a woman emerged from a nearby laundromat, her face panic-stricken as she ran toward the bus stop. She must have been the baby's mother, Henry realized, perhaps forced to step away briefly to retrieve something from the laundromat, returning to find her children in the care of this unexpected guardian. The woman's relief was palpable as she saw her babies safe and dry, and her gratitude toward the boy was evident even from Henry's distance. Henry sat in his expensive car, leather seats protecting him from the storm, climate control maintaining perfect temperature, while outside, a child stood in the rain protecting strangers' babies with nothing but cardboard and compassion. The contrast wasn't lost on him. Here was a boy who had nothing but gave everything he could, while Henry, who had everything, felt he had nothing meaningful to give anyone. The light changed, and traffic began to move, but Henry found himself pulling over to the side of the road, parking illegally as he continued to watch the scene unfold. The woman was hugging the boy now, clearly trying to press some money into his hands, but Mateo was shaking his head, backing away politely. He didn't want payment for his kindness. To him, it wasn't a transaction. It was simply what one human being did for another when they were in need. As Henry sat there, rain drumming against his car's roof, he felt something crack open inside his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in 5 years, since that terrible afternoon when time had stopped at 2:17 p.m. It was the feeling of caring about someone other than himself, of being moved by pure human goodness, of recognizing that the world still contained miracles, even if they came in the form of a 9-year-old boy with cardboard and a lullaby. When Mateo finally walked away from the bus stop, his good deed completed, Henry made a decision that surprised even himself. He put his car in drive and began to follow slowly, maintaining distance but keeping the boy in sight. He told himself he was simply curious, that he wanted to ensure the child made it home safely, but deeper down, he knew it was something more. This boy had touched something in Henry that he had thought was dead forever, a capacity for wonder, for recognition of the divine in everyday moments. As Mateo walked through the rain-soaked streets toward his home, his thin frame moving with purpose despite his obvious discomfort, Henry followed at a respectful distance, feeling like a man who had stumbled upon treasure and wasn't quite sure what to do with it. For the first time in 5 years, Henry Caldwell was thinking about someone other than his own pain, and the feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating. The boy turned a corner, disappearing momentarily from view, and Henry felt a panic that surprised him. He accelerated slightly, not wanting to lose sight of this small figure who had somehow managed to pierce through the armor of indifference that Henry had built around his heart. As he turned the same corner, he saw Mateo entering a small apartment building above a Mexican bakery, the warm light from the windows creating golden squares against the gray afternoon. Henry parked across the street, engine idling, and sat staring at the building where the boy had vanished. For the first time in years, he was curious about someone else's life. Where did this child come from? Who had raised him to be so generous? How had he learned to offer comfort so naturally, so freely? These questions swirled in Henry's mind as the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean, while something inside Henry's frozen heart began, ever so slightly, to thaw. He sat there for almost an hour, watching the windows of the apartment building, wondering which one belonged to the boy who had stood in the rain protecting babies with nothing but cardboard and song. When he finally drove away, heading back to his mansion in Lincoln Park, Henry carried with him the image of small hands holding shelter against the storm. And for the first time in 5 years, the silence in his car didn't feel quite so oppressive. That night, as Henry sat in his empty dining room eating a dinner prepared by his private chef, but tasting nothing, he found himself thinking about the boy's voice, the melody of that Spanish lullaby, the patience with which he had comforted strangers' children. It was a kindness that asked for nothing in return, a generosity that flowed from some deep well of compassion that Henry had forgotten existed in the world. The following morning brought no relief from Henry's preoccupation with the boy at the bus stop. He found himself making excuses to drive through the West Side, telling himself he was exploring potential real estate investments in the area, but really hoping to catch another glimpse of the child who had managed to disturb his carefully constructed isolation. His usual routine of financial reports and investment meetings felt hollow, mechanical actions performed by a man whose attention was elsewhere. Henry's skepticism was as natural to him as breathing, a defense mechanism honed through decades of business dealings where ulterior motives lurked behind every smile. When he finally encountered Matteo again 3 days later, this time helping an elderly man carry groceries up the steps to his apartment building, Henry's first instinct was to dismiss what he was seeing. Street kids were clever, he told himself. They learned early how to manipulate the emotions of wealthy passers-by, how to perform acts of seeming kindness in hopes of financial reward. But as Henry watched from his car, parked once again at a discreet distance, he saw something that challenged his cynical interpretation. The elderly man Matteo was helping clearly had nothing to offer. His clothes were worn, his movements slow and careful, his grocery bags filled with discount items and generic brands. This wasn't a performance designed to extract money from a wealthy mark. This was simply a boy helping someone who needed help, expecting nothing more than the satisfaction of having been useful. Still, Henry's business instincts rebelled against accepting such pure motivation. He had spent too many years in boardrooms where every gesture had strategic importance, where kindness was a currency spent in pursuit of larger goals. Surely this child was working some angle, perhaps as part of an organized scheme to soften up wealthy targets for more elaborate cons. These neighborhoods were full of such operations, Henry knew, families that trained their children to be sympathetic figures in sophisticated begging enterprises. The skepticism felt safe, familiar. It allowed Henry to maintain his emotional distance, to observe this boy as he would study a potentially fraudulent investment opportunity, with professional detachment and healthy suspicion. But even as he clung to these rational explanations, something deeper in Henry recognized the futility of his resistance. The boy's actions carried the unmistakable authenticity of genuine compassion, a quality so rare in Henry's experience that his mind struggled to accept its existence. Over the next several days, Henry found himself becoming an inadvertent student of Matteo's daily routine. He learned that the boy walked the same route to and from school each day, stopping frequently to help neighbors and strangers with small tasks that made their lives marginally easier. He would carry packages for pregnant women, help children who had fallen while playing, share his lunch with classmates who had forgotten theirs. These weren't grand gestures designed to attract attention. They were quiet acts of service, performed with the natural ease of someone for whom kindness was not a choice, but an instinct. Henry began to time his drives through the neighborhood to coincide with Matteo's school schedule, telling himself he was merely satisfying his curiosity about this anomalous child. He watched from his car as Matteo stopped to pet stray dogs, as he helped elderly residents navigate icy sidewalks, as he spent his own pocket change to buy bread for homeless individuals who gathered near the community center. Each observed act of generosity chipped away at Henry's cynical armor, forcing him to confront the possibility that genuine altruism might actually exist in the world. The internal battle between skepticism and wonder created a tension in Henry that he hadn't felt in years. His usual emotional numbness was giving way to something more complex and uncomfortable, a mixture of admiration, confusion, and a deep sadness that he couldn't quite name. This boy possessed something that Henry had lost, something he wasn't sure he had ever truly possessed, the ability to see suffering and respond with immediate, uncomplicated compassion. One afternoon, as November wind cut through Chicago's streets with particular brutality, Henry witnessed an interaction that shattered his remaining doubts about Matteo's character. The boy was walking home from school when he encountered a woman sitting on the steps of a closed shop, crying softly into her hands. Matteo didn't hesitate. He approached the woman, sat down beside her, and began to speak in gentle tones that Henry couldn't hear from his position across the street. Henry watched as the woman's posture gradually shifted from despair to something approaching comfort. Mateo had somehow managed to engage her in conversation, and soon she was wiping her eyes and even smiling slightly. The boy reached into his backpack and produced what appeared to be a juice box, part of his own lunch, and offered it to the woman. She accepted it gratefully, and they sat together for several more minutes, the boy's patient presence serving as an anchor against whatever storm had overwhelmed the woman's day. When Mateo finally stood to continue his journey home, the woman remained sitting on the steps, but her crying had stopped. She watched the boy walk away with an expression of bewildered gratitude, as if she couldn't quite believe that a child had taken time from his day to comfort a complete stranger. Henry found himself sharing her amazement. In his world, time was the most valuable commodity, carefully allocated and jealously guarded. Yet this boy had given his time freely, asking nothing in return except the opportunity to ease someone else's pain. The encounter forced Henry to confront an uncomfortable truth. His skepticism was not protecting him from deception, but from hope itself. He had spent 5 years building walls around his heart, convincing himself that the world was a place devoid of genuine goodness, that everyone operated from selfish motives, that kindness was always transactional. But this boy's behavior consistently contradicted those beliefs, offering evidence of a kind of purity that Henry had thought existed only in fairy tales and religious parables. As he drove home that evening through Lincoln Park's tree-lined streets, past mansions that rivaled his own in their cold perfection, Henry felt the stirrings of something he hadn't experienced since Sarah and Emma's deaths: curiosity about another person's inner life. What drove this boy to such consistent compassion? What had taught him to see the world as a place where his small actions could make a meaningful difference? How had he learned to give so freely in a society that seemed designed to teach the opposite lesson? These questions followed Henry into his empty mansion, where the stopped clock seemed to tick more loudly than usual, where the silence felt less like peace and more like accusation. For the first time in years, Henry found himself wondering what Sarah would have thought of the boy, what Emma would have said about his gentle manner with the babies at the bus stop. The thought should have brought pain, as memories of his family always did, but instead, he felt something softer, a kind of wistful curiosity about how his lost loved ones might have responded to this unexpected encounter with grace made visible in a 9-year-old boy. That night, Henry sat in his study surrounded by financial documents that suddenly seemed less important than they had that morning, and allowed himself to consider a possibility that terrified him. Perhaps his cynicism had been wrong. Perhaps the world still contained miracles, and perhaps he had just been too afraid to see them. The first sign arrived on a Tuesday morning in early December, so subtle that Henry initially dismissed it as coincidence. He had awakened at his usual time and was walking through his mansion's hallways when he heard it, the soft, steady ticking of a clock. For a moment, he stood frozen, convinced that his mind was playing tricks on him. All 23 clocks in the house had been silent for 5 years, their hands permanently frozen at 2:17 p.m., monuments to the moment when his world had stopped. But the sound was unmistakably real, the gentle rhythmic pulse of time moving forward. Henry followed the sound to the living room, where an antique grandfather clock that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother now displayed 6:42 a.m., its brass pendulum swinging with steady determination. The clock had been wound, though Henry couldn't remember doing so, and its movement seemed to fill the room with a kind of alive presence that the mansion hadn't felt in years. Henry stared at the clock for several minutes, watching its hands move with the patient persistence of time reasserting itself in his frozen world. He reached toward the pendulum, intending to stop it, to restore the silence that had become his comfort, but his hand hesitated in midair. There was something about the clock's gentle determination that reminded him of the boy at the bus stop, the same quiet persistence in doing what needed to be done, regardless of circumstances. Over the following days, more clocks began to tick. Henry would discover them at random moments, the kitchen clock chiming the half hour while he drank his morning coffee, the clock in his study marking the passage of afternoon hours with soft clicks that punctuated his financial meetings. He never saw who was winding them, never caught Mrs. Rodriguez or any of his staff in the act, but gradually, inevitably, his mansion was filling with the sound of time moving forward. The change should have disturbed him, should have sent him into the kind of panic that had characterized his early grief. Instead, Henry found himself oddly comforted by the gentle temporal rhythm that was slowly returning to his home. The ticking clock seemed to whisper that life continued, that moments accumulated into hours and days and years, that the frozen instant of 2:17 p.m. was just one point on a longer journey that had not actually ended with Sarah and Emma's deaths. On Thursday afternoon, as Henry sat in his office reviewing quarterly reports from his cryptocurrency investments, he heard something that made him drop his tablet in surprise. From somewhere in the mansion came the faint sound of music, a melody he hadn't heard in 5 years. It was Emma's favorite song, a gentle jazz standard called "The Way You Look Tonight," playing on the old radio in what had been her playroom. Henry rushed toward the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs. The playroom door, which had remained closed since the funeral, was now standing slightly ajar, warm light spilling into the hallway. Inside, the vintage radio that Emma had discovered in Sarah's grandmother's attic was playing the familiar tune, its warm tones filling the space with a kind of golden presence that made Henry's eyes water with unexpected tears. He had been certain the radio was broken. In the months following the accident, he had tried repeatedly to make it work, desperate for any connection to his daughter's memory, but it had remained stubbornly silent. Yet now it played Emma's song with crystal clarity, as if 5 years of silence had been just a pause between movements in a longer symphony. Henry stood in the doorway, not daring to enter the room fully, letting the music wash over him like baptism. The song carried with it a flood of memories. Emma dancing in her pajamas while Sarah made breakfast. Emma insisting that this was the most beautiful song in the whole world. Emma singing along in her high, sweet voice that had been silenced far too soon. But instead of the crushing grief these memories usually brought, Henry felt something softer, a kind of bittersweet gratitude for having had these moments at all. As the song ended and the radio returned to static, Henry noticed something else that made his breath catch. On Emma's small desk, where coloring books and crayons had once been scattered with childish abandon, someone had left a single drawing. It was clearly the work of a child, created with crayons and markers in the vibrant, unrestrained style that adults had long since forgotten how to access. The drawing showed a house, but not just any house. It was Henry's mansion, recognizable by its distinctive architectural details, its grand entrance, its imposing clock tower. But in the child's interpretation, the house was surrounded by flowers and sunshine, with smoke curling cheerfully from the chimney and birds flying overhead. In the front yard, stick figures of a man and a small boy stood together, both smiling, both reaching toward the bright yellow sun that dominated the upper corner of the page. At the bottom of the drawing, in careful block letters, someone had written, "For the sad man who needs to smile again." Henry picked up the drawing with trembling hands, studying every crayon stroke, every carefully chosen color. The paper felt warm, as if it had just been completed. Though no one should have been able to enter Emma's room. His security system would have detected any intrusion, his staff would have reported any unusual activity. Yet, here was this gift, this message of hope created by small hands that somehow understood his need for healing. The drawing's simple message penetrated defenses that years of therapy and well-meaning friends had been unable to breach. Here was recognition of his sadness, acknowledgement of his pain, but also gentle suggestion that smiling was still possible, that joy might return if he could find the courage to let it. The child who had created this drawing, and Henry was certain it was Matteo, though he couldn't explain how the boy had managed to place it in his locked mansion, had somehow seen past his wealth and success to the broken heart beneath. That evening, Henry did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He ate dinner in the kitchen instead of the formal dining room, the child's drawing propped against a water glass where he could see it clearly. Mrs. Rodriguez discovered him there when she arrived the next morning, and though she said nothing, Henry caught her small smile of approval as she prepared his breakfast at the kitchen island instead of the isolated dining room table. The changes continued to accumulate like gentle snowfall. Windows that had remained curtained for years began to show slivers of natural light. The mansion's sound system, which had been silent since the accident, began to play soft background music. Not Emma's jazz standards, which would have been too painful, but gentle classical pieces that filled the empty rooms with something approaching warmth. Fresh flowers appeared in vases throughout the house, their colors and scents bringing life to spaces that had felt more like museums than homes. Henry found himself noticing these changes with a mixture of wonder and fear. Part of him wanted to resist, to restore the protective emptiness that had been his companion for so long, but a larger part of him was curious about where this transformation might lead, about what kind of person he might become if he allowed hope to take root in the carefully tended garden of his grief. Most remarkable was the change in his own behavior. Henry began to linger in rooms instead of hurrying through them, to actually taste his food instead of consuming it mechanically, to look out windows at the city beyond, instead of keeping his gaze fixed on financial documents and computer screens. He started taking walks through Lincoln Park, something he hadn't done since the early days of his marriage, when he and Sarah would stroll hand in hand along the lakefront, planning their future together. During one of these walks, on a crisp December afternoon, when the lake was steel gray under winter clouds, Henry encountered an elderly man sitting alone on a bench, feeding pigeons from a small bag of breadcrumbs. The man looked cold, his thin jacket inadequate protection against the wind that swept across the water, but his face held a contentment that Henry envied. For the first time in years, Henry approached a stranger with genuine curiosity rather than professional calculation. He sat down beside the man and asked about the pigeons, about whether he came to the park often, about how long he had been feeding the birds. The conversation that followed was simple, meaningless in any business sense, but it filled Henry with a warmth that expensive meals and luxury accommodations had been unable to provide. When the man mentioned that he lived alone in a nearby senior housing complex, that these daily visits to feed the pigeons were often the highlight of his social contact, Henry felt something stir in his chest, the same recognition of need that he had witnessed in Mateo's interactions with neighbors and strangers. Before he could second-guess the impulse, Henry offered to drive the man home, an offer that was accepted with surprised gratitude. As they walked together toward Henry's car, the elderly man chatting about his late wife and his children who lived in distant cities, Henry realized that this was the first time in 5 years that he had offered to help someone purely because they needed help, not because it served some larger strategic purpose. The feeling was simultaneously foreign and familiar, like recovering a language he had once spoken fluently, but had almost forgotten how to use. That night, as Henry sat in his study with financial reports spread across his desk, he found himself unable to concentrate on profit margins and dividend yields. Instead, his thoughts kept returning to the elderly man's face when Henry had offered him a ride, the way simple kindness had transformed a stranger's afternoon into something brighter. For the first time, Henry began to understand what he had witnessed in Mateo's behavior, the profound satisfaction that came from meeting another person's need without expectation of return. The boy's influence was working on him like water on stone, gentle but persistent, wearing away the accumulated hardness of years spent protecting himself from further loss. Henry was beginning to remember that before tragedy had frozen his heart, he had been capable of spontaneous generosity, of seeing the world as a place where his actions could make a positive difference. The memory was fragile, like a plant beginning to grow in winter soil, but it was undeniably present. As December progressed and Chicago settled into its winter rhythm of early darkness and lake-effect snow, Henry found himself making excuses to drive through Mateo's neighborhood with increasing frequency. His visits were no longer entirely passive observations. Several times he had parked and walked through the area on foot, drawn by a curiosity that had grown too strong to satisfy from the distance of his car. The transformation in his own behavior continued to surprise him. He began to notice things that he had previously filtered out: homeless individuals seeking shelter in doorways, elderly residents struggling with heavy shopping bags, children playing in inadequate winter clothing. These observations didn't remain abstract. They triggered responses that seemed to come from some buried part of his character that was slowly awakening from long dormancy. One snowy afternoon in mid-December, as Henry walked through the streets near Matteo's apartment building, he witnessed another act of kindness that stopped him in his tracks. The boy was walking home from school when he encountered a homeless woman sitting in the doorway of a closed shop, shivering despite the layers of clothing she had wrapped around herself. Without hesitation, Matteo removed his own winter jacket, a thin coat that was clearly his only protection against the cold, and offered it to the woman. Henry watched from across the street as the woman initially refused the gift, recognizing that the boy needed the jacket for himself. But Matteo persisted with gentle insistence, explaining in his soft voice that he lived nearby and could get home quickly, while she would be outside much longer. Finally, the woman accepted the coat, wrapping it around her shoulders with tears streaming down her weathered face. The scene struck Henry with the force of revelation. Here was a child who possessed almost nothing, offering what little he had to someone who possessed even less. The generosity wasn't calculated or strategic. It was simply the natural response of someone who could not witness suffering without attempting to alleviate it. The contrast, with Henry's own hoarded wealth, his carefully protected resources, his reluctance to extend himself beyond the boundaries of professional obligation, was stark and uncomfortable. As Matteo continued his walk home, now shivering in just his school sweater, Henry felt a compulsion that surprised him. Without conscious decision, he found himself following the boy to the small apartment building above the bakery. For the first time, instead of observing from a distance, Henry climbed the stairs and knocked on the door he had watched Matteo enter so many times. Rosa Ramirez opened the door with the cautious expression of someone who had learned to be wary of unexpected visitors. She was a small woman in her early 30s, her dark hair pulled back severely, her clothes clean, but showing the wear of someone who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. When she saw Henry, a well-dressed stranger whose expensive coat and polished shoes marked him immediately as someone from a different economic sphere, her wariness deepened into suspicion. "Can I help you?" she asked in accented but clear English, positioning herself protectively in the doorway. Henry suddenly realized he hadn't prepared for this moment, hadn't considered what he would say to explain his presence at this family's door. The truth, that he had been following her son, studying his behavior, drawn by qualities that challenged everything Henry thought he knew about human nature, would sound stalkerish and disturbing. But standing there in the hallway that smelled of fresh bread and family life, Henry found himself speaking with an honesty that surprised him. "I've seen your son," he said simply. "I've watched him help people. Today I saw him give his jacket to a homeless woman. I wanted to meet the family that raised someone so generous." Rosa's expression softened slightly, though caution remained. "You know Matteo?" she asked. Before Henry could respond, the boy himself appeared beside his mother, his face lighting up with recognition. "You're the man from the car," he said with a smile that held no fear, only curious welcome. "I saw you watching sometimes. Mommy, this is the senor I told you about, the one who looks sad." The simple words hit Henry like a physical blow. This child had not only noticed his observation, but had somehow perceived the deeper sadness that Henry thought he had hidden behind expensive suits and professional composure. Moreover, Matteo had discussed him with his mother, had identified him as someone deserving of concern rather than suspicion. Rosa looked between her son and Henry with growing understanding. "You are the man Matteo prays for," she said, her voice gentling. "He says there is a senor who drives through our neighborhood with eyes full of dolor. He asks God to help this man find peace. The revelation that this child had been praying for him, that his pain had been visible enough to prompt intercession from a 9-year-old boy, created an emotional earthquake in Henry's carefully controlled world. He had spent 5 years believing himself invisible in his grief, convinced that his professional facade successfully masked the broken man beneath. Yet this boy had seen through his defenses with the clarity of genuine compassion. For a moment, Henry couldn't speak. Standing in the narrow hallway outside this modest apartment, surrounded by the sounds and smells of family life that his own mansion so desperately lacked, he felt the walls he had built around his heart beginning to crack. When he finally found his voice, it was rough with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 5 years. "May I come in?" he asked. In the weeks that followed, Henry found himself becoming a regular visitor to the Ramirez family's small apartment above the bakery. What had begun as curiosity evolved into something deeper, a genuine friendship that defied every boundary of class, culture, and circumstance that should have kept their worlds separate. Rosa's initial suspicion gradually gave way to cautious acceptance, and then to something approaching maternal concern for this wealthy man whose sadness her son had recognized so clearly. The apartment was tiny by Henry's standards: 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen barely large enough for 2 people, a living room that served as dining room, homework space, and recreation area all at once. But it possessed something that Henry's mansion had lost: the warm chaos of a home where people actually lived, where laughter and conversation and even occasional arguments created the rhythm of daily life. Mateo welcomed Henry with the uncomplicated acceptance that seemed to characterize all his interactions with the world. He would show Henry his schoolwork, his drawings, his small collection of books that he read over and over because new ones were rarely affordable. He would ask Henry about his work, about his big house, about whether he had children of his own, questions that might have been painful but somehow weren't when delivered in Mateo's gentle voice. It was in response to that last question that Henry first spoke aloud about Emma and Sarah. Sitting at the small kitchen table while Rosa prepared dinner and Mateo worked on homework, Henry found himself describing his daughter, her love of music, her gap-toothed grin, her tendency to sing jazz standards while dancing in her pajamas. He spoke about Sarah too, about her laughter, her fierce love for their family, her dreams for the future they would never share. Rosa listened while she cooked, occasionally murmuring sympathetic sounds, while Mateo looked up from his homework with the serious expression he wore when processing adult information. When Henry finished, his voice rough with barely contained emotion, Mateo reached across the table and placed his small hand over Henry's larger one. "They are with God now," the boy said simply, "but they watch you. That is why you found me. They sent you to remember how to be happy again." The words carried such conviction, such absolute certainty in the presence of divine love and continuing connection, that Henry felt something inside his chest release, a knot of grief and guilt that had been choking him for 5 years. He had been to therapists, had read books about loss and healing, had heard countless well-meaning platitudes about time healing all wounds, but none of it had reached him the way this child's simple statement of faith did. As winter deepened and Chicago settled into the gray months of January and February, Henry's visits to the Ramirez apartment became a regular part of his routine. He would stop by after work, often bringing small gifts, books from Mateo's collection, groceries that Rosa would initially protest before accepting with grateful dignity, small toys and school supplies that made the boy's face light up with joy. But more than material gifts, Henry brought something that surprised even himself: genuine interest in their lives, their dreams, their challenges. He helped Mateo with homework, sharing knowledge accumulated through years of business education, but adapted to a 9-year-old's comprehension level. He listened to Rosa's stories about her work at the hospital, her concerns about Mateo's education, her dreams of someday saving enough money to move to a larger apartment in a safer neighborhood. In return, they gave him something he hadn't realized he desperately needed: inclusion in the warm chaos of family life. Rosa would set a place for him at dinner without being asked, assuming his presence as naturally as if he were a favored uncle. Matteo would save his best drawings to show Henry, would ask for his opinion on school projects, would curl up beside him on the small sofa while Rosa watched telenovelas, and provided running commentary in rapid Spanish, punctuated by occasional English translations for Henry's benefit. But perhaps most importantly, they gave him permission to remember joy without guilt. In this family's company, Henry found himself laughing for the first time since the accident, really laughing, not the polite chuckles he produced at business meetings, but deep, genuine laughter that seemed to echo from some part of himself he had thought was dead. When Matteo would tell stories about his classmates or perform elaborate reenactments of playground dramas, Henry would find himself doubled over with mirth in a way that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The guilt he expected to feel at these moments of happiness never came. Instead, he felt something that might have been Sarah and Emma's approval, as if their love for him included wanting him to find joy again, to remember that life contained beauty worth celebrating. Matteo's faith in the continuing presence of those who had died became a bridge that allowed Henry to honor his family's memory by choosing to live fully rather than merely surviving. As spring began to hint at its return to Chicago, with Lake Michigan losing some of its winter gray and early crocuses pushing through the last patches of snow in Lincoln Park, Henry realized that the transformation he had initially resisted was now complete. The man who had spent 5 years frozen in time, surrounded by stopped clocks and shuttered memories, had somehow learned to move forward again. Not away from Sarah and Emma's love, but deeper into it, understanding finally that grief was not a prison, but a passage, painful, necessary, and ultimately leading to a larger capacity for loving the world they had left behind. The crisis came suddenly, as such things often do, on a cold February morning when Chicago woke to the kind of bitter wind that cut through even the warmest clothing like a blade of ice. Henry had arrived at his office to find his assistant waiting with an expression of barely contained excitement. The cryptocurrency market had exploded overnight. Bitcoin and several alternative currencies had surged to unprecedented heights, and Henry's carefully diversified portfolio had increased in value by nearly 40% in a single trading session. The numbers on his computer screen were staggering. His net worth, already substantial, had jumped by hundreds of millions of dollars while he slept. Financial news networks were calling it a historic moment, the kind of market event that created legends in the investment world. His phone rang constantly with calls from business reporters, fellow investors, and financial advisors, all wanting to discuss the implications of this windfall. But as Henry stared at the figures scrolling across his multiple monitors, he felt something unexpected: indifference. The money, substantial though it was, seemed abstract, meaningless in the context of what had become truly important to him. His thoughts turned immediately to the Ramirez family, to Rosa's worries about Matteo's education, to the thin walls of their apartment that couldn't keep out Chicago's winter cold, to the careful way Rosa stretched groceries to last until her next paycheck. Without consulting his financial advisors or considering the tax implications, Henry made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. He liquidated a significant portion of his new cryptocurrency gains and established a trust fund for Matteo's education, enough to ensure the boy could attend any college he chose, pursue any dream his remarkable heart could imagine. But more immediately, he arranged for Rosa to receive a generous monthly stipend, presented his payment for consulting services to preserve her dignity while ensuring she would never again have to choose between heating their apartment and buying adequate food. The arrangements took several weeks to finalize through his attorneys, time during which Henry continued his regular visits to the apartment above the bakery, saying nothing about the financial plans taking shape behind the scenes. He wanted the gifts to be complete surprises, wanted to see the moment when this family realized that their economic struggles were over, that better days stretched ahead of them like a promise fulfilled. But fate, as it often does, intervened with its own timeline. Henry was in a board meeting on a Tuesday morning in early March, half listening to quarterly projections while his mind wandered to plans for the weekend. He was going to take Matteo to the Museum of Science and Industry, something the boy had mentioned wanting to do but which Rosa couldn't afford, when his assistant knocked on the conference room door with unusual urgency. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice tight with concern. "There's been an emergency. Rosa Ramirez called. Matteo is in the hospital." The bottom dropped out of Henry's world. He stood abruptly from the conference table, ignoring the surprised looks of his fellow board members, and was heading toward the door before his assistant finished speaking. The drive to University of Chicago Medical Center, where Rosa worked and where, by grim coincidence, her son had been taken, passed in a blur of racing pulse and desperate prayers to a God Henry wasn't sure he believed in, but found himself addressing with passionate intensity. He found Rosa in the pediatric ward waiting area, still wearing her hospital cleaning uniform, her face streaked with tears and hollow with the particular terror that belongs to parents whose children are in danger. She looked up as Henry approached, her expression mixing relief at seeing a familiar face with the raw fear that had been consuming her since the phone call from Matteo's school. "He collapsed during recess," she said before Henry could ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "The teachers said he was playing and then suddenly he fell down. He wouldn't wake up. They brought him here and the doctors—" Her voice broke and she couldn't continue. Henry sat beside her in the uncomfortable plastic chair, taking her trembling hands in his steady ones. "What did the doctors say?" he asked gently. Rosa's explanation came in fragments punctuated by tears. The preliminary diagnosis was acute pneumonia, possibly complicated by malnutrition and exposure to cold. Matteo's immune system, weakened by months of giving away his warm clothing and sharing his already inadequate meals with others who had less, had finally succumbed to infection. He was on oxygen, receiving intravenous antibiotics, his small body fighting a battle that had claimed too many children from neighborhoods like theirs. "I should have seen," Rosa whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "I should have noticed he was getting sick, but he never complains, never says when he doesn't feel good. He just keeps helping everyone else, keeps giving away everything he has, keeps smiling like nothing is wrong." Henry felt his own throat tighten with emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. The boy who had taught him to hope again, who had shown him that kindness still existed in the world, who had somehow reached through 5 years of grief to touch a heart that had thought itself permanently closed, was now fighting for his life because his generosity had literally weakened him to the point of collapse. They waited together through the long afternoon and into the evening. Rosa couldn't afford to take time off work, but her supervisor, who knew about Matteo's hospitalization, had arranged for other staff to cover her shifts. Henry called his office and canceled all meetings indefinitely, ignoring his assistant's concerns about important business that couldn't wait. Nothing was more important than being present for this family that had become the center of his world. As the hours passed, other members of the community began to arrive. Mrs. Martinez from the bakery downstairs brought food that neither Henry nor Rosa could eat, but which spoke to the depth of a neighborhood concern for this boy who had touched so many lives. Teachers from Matteo's school stopped by with cards made by his classmates. Elderly residents whom Matteo had helped with groceries and household tasks came by to offer prayers and support. Henry watched this outpouring of love with wonder and growing understanding. Matteo's influence extended far beyond what Henry had witnessed during his months of observation. This child had created a web of connection throughout his community, touching lives in ways that seemed almost impossible for someone so young. The waiting room filled with people who had been recipients of his kindness, all of them now desperate to return some portion of the love he had given them. Late that evening, a doctor emerged from the intensive care unit with an expression that made Henry's heart stop. Dr. Patricia Williams was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the particular weariness that belonged to physicians who worked with sick children. She looked around the crowded waiting room, taking in the faces of all these people united by concern for one small boy. "Are you all here for Mateo Ramirez?" she asked, her voice gentle but professional. Rosa stood immediately, Henry rising beside her for support. "I'm his mother," she said. "How is he?" Dr. Williams smiled, and the waiting room collectively exhaled. "He's stable. The antibiotics are working, and his fever is broken. He's going to need several days of hospitalization and weeks of recovery time, but he's going to be fine." The relief that flooded the room was almost tangible. People hugged each other, cried with gratitude, offered up prayers of thanksgiving in multiple languages. But Dr. Williams wasn't finished speaking. "I have to tell you," she continued, addressing the group but focusing particularly on Rosa, "in 30 years of pediatric medicine, I've rarely seen a community rally around a child the way you all have for Mateo. The nursing staff tells me that people have been calling all day, asking about him, offering to help in any way they can. That level of love doesn't happen by accident. This boy must be very special." Rosa nodded through her tears. "He is," she said simply. "He sees the good in everyone, helps anyone who needs it. Sometimes I think God sent him to teach the rest of us how to be better people." Henry felt those words resonate in his chest with the force of absolute truth. That was exactly what Mateo had done for him, taught him to be better, shown him that the world still contained wonder worth embracing, demonstrated that love could still take root in the most unlikely soil. As the crowd began to disperse, people heading home with promises to return the next day, Henry remained with Rosa in the waiting room. They sat in comfortable silence, processing the day's emotional roller coaster, grateful that the crisis had passed but sobered by how close they had come to losing someone irreplaceable. "Rosa," Henry said finally, his voice soft in the quiet room, "there's something I need to tell you, something I've been planning." He told her about the trust fund, about the monthly stipend, about his decision to ensure that neither she nor Mateo would ever again have to struggle financially. He explained about the cryptocurrency windfall, about his realization that money meant nothing unless it was used to serve love, about his desire to honor the lessons her son had taught him by making their lives easier. Rosa listened in stunned silence, her eyes widening as she began to understand the magnitude of what Henry was describing. When he finished, she was crying again. But these were different tears, tears of overwhelming gratitude mixed with a kind of awe that felt almost religious in its intensity. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you do this for us?" Henry considered the question, thinking back over the months since that first rainy afternoon when he had watched Mateo protect babies with nothing but cardboard and song. "Because your son saved my life," he said finally. "I didn't know I was dying until he showed me how to live again." The next morning brought news that seemed to confirm the miraculous nature of Mateo's recovery. When Henry and Rosa arrived at the hospital, they found the boy sitting up in his hospital bed, color returned to his cheeks, his eyes bright with the familiar warmth that had first captured Henry's attention months ago. He was drawing with crayons that one of the nurses had provided, his small hands moving with their usual careful precision. "Señor Henry," Mateo called out as soon as he saw them, his voice still weak but filled with joy. "I had the most beautiful dream. I dreamed that angels came to visit me, and they looked just like you and Mommy." Rosa rushed to embrace her son, tears streaming down her face as she felt his arms wrap around her with strength that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Henry stood back, watching this reunion with emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. The boy was going to be fine. The child who had become his unexpected salvation was safe, healthy, ready to continue spreading his particular brand of grace throughout the world. But Mateo wasn't finished with his revelations. "Señor Henry," he said, looking at him with those soil-dark eyes that seemed to see more than any child's eyes should. "In my dream, the angels told me something important. They said you have been carrying sadness for too long, that it's time to let it go. They said your wife and daughter are happy where they are, but they want you to be happy too." The words hit Henry like lightning, illuminating corners of his heart that had been dark for 5 years. This child, barely recovered from a life-threatening illness, was offering him the very absolution he had been unable to find through years of grief and guilty self-protection. But more than that, Matteo was delivering a message that felt like it came directly from Sarah and Emma themselves. Permission to heal, encouragement to embrace joy, blessing to move forward into a life they would have wanted him to live. Henry felt something release in his chest, a tightness that had been his constant companion since that terrible afternoon when time had stopped at 2:17 p.m. For the first time in 5 years, he could imagine a future that honored his family's memory, not through perpetual mourning, but through purposeful living, through the kind of generous love that Matteo had been modeling all along. "Thank you," he whispered to the boy, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Matteo smiled, the expression transforming his still pale face into something radiant. "That's what friends do," he said simply. "They help each other remember how to smile." The weeks that followed brought changes to Henry's life that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. As Matteo recovered his strength and returned to school, Henry found himself applying the lessons of generosity he had learned from the boy to every aspect of his existence. The fortune that had once been merely a numbers game, a way of keeping score in a competition he no longer cared about winning, became a tool for multiplication of the kindness he had witnessed in a 9-year-old's actions. The trust fund for Matteo's education was just the beginning. Henry established a foundation focused on supporting at-risk children and families in Chicago's underserved neighborhoods, hiring staff who understood that charity without dignity was just another form of violence. The foundation provided scholarships, after-school programs, emergency assistance for families facing medical crises, and mentorship opportunities that connected successful adults with children who needed to see that their dreams were achievable. But more than writing checks, Henry found himself personally involved in the foundation's work in ways that surprised even him. He began spending several days a week in the communities the foundation served, not as a wealthy benefactor dispensing largesse from a safe distance, but as someone genuinely committed to understanding the challenges these families faced and the strengths they possessed. He discovered that his business skills, refined through years of high-stakes negotiations and strategic planning, translated remarkably well to nonprofit work. But more importantly, he found that his months of observing Matteo had taught him something that no MBA program could provide: the ability to listen without judgment, to see potential in struggling situations, to recognize that every person carried dignity worthy of respect, regardless of their economic circumstances. The mansion in Lincoln Park underwent its own transformation. Rooms that had been sealed against memory were open to light and sound again. Henry hired a housekeeper who was instructed to make the space feel alive: fresh flowers in every room, soft music playing throughout the day, curtains open to let in the natural light that reflected off Lake Michigan. The stopped clocks were not only wound, but replaced with chiming versions that marked the passage of time with gentle music rather than harsh mechanical ticking. Most significantly, Henry converted Emma's playroom into something Sarah would have loved: a library filled with children's books from around the world, comfortable reading chairs positioned near tall windows, art supplies, and musical instruments available for any child who visited. The foundation began hosting weekly reading circles there, bringing groups of children from the programs Henry supported to explore literature and creativity in an environment designed to nurture their highest aspirations. The first time Henry heard children's laughter echoing through his mansion's halls again, he thought his heart might break from the beauty of it. But instead of the pain he expected, he felt something that might have been healing: the sense that love, once given freely, multiplied beyond the giver's ability to contain or control it. Rosa had protested Henry's financial support initially, her pride warring with her recognition of how much easier their lives could be with adequate resources. But Henry had insisted, and eventually she had accepted not just the monthly stipend, but also a position as community liaison for his foundation. Her insider's knowledge of the neighborhoods they served, combined with her natural empathy and fierce protective instincts for vulnerable families, made her invaluable in ensuring that the foundation's resources reached the people who needed them most. Watching Rosa blossom in her new role brought Henry almost as much satisfaction as watching Matteo recover his strength. She had dreams of her own that poverty had forced into dormancy. She wanted to return to school, to pursue the nursing degree she had abandoned when Matteo's father had left them. With financial security assured, she enrolled in night classes at community college, studying toward a goal that would allow her to heal others professionally, as her son had been healing them through simple acts of kindness. But it was Matteo himself who provided the most powerful evidence of the transformation that love could work in seemingly impossible circumstances. As his health returned and he settled into the knowledge that his family's basic needs were secure, the boy's natural generosity seemed to expand rather than diminish. With his mother's permission and Henry's support, he began visiting other hospitalized children, bringing drawings and stories, sharing the same gentle presence that had worked such magic in Henry's frozen heart. The hospital staff quickly recognized Matteo's unusual gift for comfort. Children who had been withdrawn and frightened would brighten when he entered their rooms. Families worn down by medical crises would find themselves laughing at his stories or joining in the soft songs he would sing when words seemed inadequate. Dr. Williams, who had treated Matteo during his own hospitalization, began requesting his presence with particularly challenging cases, children whose fear or pain had made them resistant to medical intervention. "I've never seen anything like it," she told Henry during one of their monthly meetings to discuss the Foundation's healthcare initiatives. "That boy has a healing presence that goes beyond anything I learned in medical school. I've seen him help children accept necessary treatments just by sitting with them and talking about courage. Some of our toughest cases have turned around after spending time with Matteo." Henry understood exactly what Dr. Williams meant. He had experienced Matteo's healing presence himself, had felt the boy's capacity to see past surface presentations to the fear or sadness underneath, to respond to that deeper need with exactly the kind of attention that could transform despair into hope. It was a gift that defied medical explanation, but produced results that no physician could argue with. As spring gave way to summer and Chicago emerged from its winter cocoon into the vibrant promise of warm months by the lake, Henry found himself reflecting on the year that had changed everything. The man who had spent 5 years frozen in grief, surrounded by stopped clocks and sealed memories, had somehow learned to live in time again. Not by forgetting Sarah and Emma, but by honoring them through the kind of generous love they would have recognized and celebrated. The Foundation's first annual report documented impressive statistics: hundreds of children receiving educational support, dozens of families lifted out of crisis by emergency assistance, community programs that were strengthening neighborhoods throughout Chicago's South and West Sides. But Henry knew the real measure of success couldn't be captured in numbers. It lived in the laughter echoing through his mansion's halls, in Rosa's confidence as she pursued her nursing degree, in Matteo's continued capacity to find someone who needed help and offer exactly what they required most. On a warm evening in late June, as the city settled into the golden hour when Lake Michigan reflected the sky like polished bronze and the sounds of summer life drifted through open windows, Henry hosted the Foundation's first major fundraising event in his restored mansion. The rooms that had been silent for so long now buzzed with conversation as donors, board members, staff, and program participants mingled in spaces designed to celebrate rather than mourn. But the evening's most powerful moment came not during the formal presentations or financial announcements, but during an unscripted moment when Matteo, now 10 years old and glowing with health, stood up to address the crowd that had gathered to support the foundation's work. "I want to thank Senor Henry," the boy said, his voice clear and strong as it carried through the mansion's main salon. "He taught me that when God gives you a lot, it's so you can share it with people who don't have enough. But mostly, he taught me that the best way to heal a broken heart is to help other people fix theirs." The words hung in the air like a benediction, capturing a truth that all the financial reports and strategic plans couldn't express. Henry felt tears gathering in his eyes as he looked around the room at faces that reflected the same moved recognition he was experiencing. This child had somehow managed to articulate the deepest lesson of their shared journey, that healing came not through self-protection, but through self-giving, not through building walls against further loss, but through opening doors to greater love. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Henry found himself standing on the mansion's terrace overlooking Lake Michigan. The water stretched toward a horizon where the last light of day painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, and for the first time since Sarah and Emma's deaths, Henry felt complete peace with the passage of time. The clocks in his house ticked steadily now, marking moments that accumulated into hours and days and years. But instead of racing toward some fearful future or remaining trapped in a painful past, time had become a gift, space within which love could grow and multiply and transform the world in ways both small and magnificent. Matteo joined him on the terrace, the boy's presence as natural and welcome as sunrise after a long night. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the lake's gentle waves catch and release the evening light. Two souls who had found in each other exactly what they had needed most. "Senor Henry," Matteo said finally, his voice soft in the gathering dusk, "do you think your wife and daughter are happy about what we're doing?" Henry considered the question, thinking about Sarah's fierce love for children, about Emma's generous spirit, about the values they would have wanted him to live by even after they were gone. "Yes," he said finally. "I think they're very happy. I think they sent you to remind me how to live the way they would have wanted me to." Matteo nodded, satisfied with this answer. "My abuela used to say that angels sometimes come disguised as regular people, so we have to treat everyone with love just in case. Maybe that's what happened with us. Maybe we were angels for each other and just didn't know it at first." The words carried such simple wisdom, such direct understanding of the mystery they had both experienced, that Henry felt his throat tighten with emotion. This child continued to amaze him with his capacity to find meaning in their unlikely friendship, to recognize the sacred hidden within the ordinary circumstances of their meeting. As summer deepened into autumn and Chicago prepared once again for winter's arrival, the rhythms of Henry's transformed life settled into patterns that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. His days were full but no longer empty, busy with foundation work that felt more like calling than profession. His evenings were often spent at the Ramirez apartment, sharing dinner and conversation with the family that had become his anchor in a world that no longer felt foreign or hostile. Rosa was thriving in her nursing program, her natural compassion finding professional expression in courses that prepared her to heal others in ways her son had been healing them all along. She would graduate in the spring, and Henry had already arranged for her to receive a full scholarship to pursue her bachelor's degree if she chose. But more than academic success, Rosa was blooming into the confident woman she had always been, underneath the protective wariness that poverty and single motherhood had required her to wear. Matteo continued to astonish everyone who encountered him. His teachers reported that he was an exceptional student, but more remarkable was his continued capacity for kindness that seemed to grow rather than diminish as he matured. The hospital visits had become a regular part of his routine, officially recognized by the medical staff as therapeutic interventions that produced results no traditional treatment could match. Dr. Williams had begun documenting his interactions with difficult patients, considering research into what she had started calling the Mateo effect, the phenomenon by which the boy's presence seemed to accelerate healing in ways that challenged medical understanding. But perhaps most importantly, the boy remained essentially unchanged by the attention and resources that now surrounded him. He still helped neighbors carry groceries, still shared his lunch with classmates who had forgotten theirs, still approached every human interaction with the same gentle curiosity and immediate compassion that had first caught Henry's attention on that rainy afternoon nearly 2 years ago. The Foundation's work continued to expand, but always with the careful attention to dignity and community partnership that Henry had learned from watching Mateo's approach to helping others. Instead of imposing solutions from outside, the Foundation worked to amplify existing strengths within the communities it served, providing resources that allowed people to solve their own problems rather than creating dependence on external support. New programs emerged organically from relationships built through patient listening and authentic partnership. A community garden project grew out of conversations with elderly residents who missed the rural landscapes of their youth. A youth entrepreneurship program developed when teenagers expressed interest in starting their own businesses. A grandparents' reading circle began when someone noticed how many children were being raised by elderly relatives who struggled with changing educational expectations. Each program bore the distinctive marks of Mateo's influence: attention to the whole person rather than just immediate need, recognition that everyone possessed gifts worth sharing, faith that small acts of love could produce transformations beyond what logic would predict. Henry found himself applying these principles not just to foundation work, but to every aspect of his business dealings, treating employees and partners with the same dignity and respect that Mateo showed to everyone he encountered. The changes weren't always easy. Henry's transformation from isolated millionaire to engaged community member required him to confront aspects of wealth and privilege that he had previously taken for granted. Board meetings that had once felt like strategic games now seemed tinged with moral complexity when decisions affected real families rather than abstract market forces. Investment choices that had once been purely financial calculations now carried weight as expressions of values Henry was still learning to articulate. But these challenges felt manageable in ways that his earlier grief had not. He had learned from Mateo that the antidote to overwhelming difficulty was not self-protection, but service to others. Not building higher walls, but creating more connections, not hoarding resources against uncertain futures, but sharing them in response to present need. As the second anniversary of their first meeting approached, Henry found himself planning a quiet celebration, not of the day they had met, but of all the ways their friendship had multiplied beyond what either of them could have imagined. The Foundation would be announcing a major expansion of its programs. Rosa would be graduating from nursing school, and Mateo would be starting his transition into middle school as a confident, academically successful student whose future stretched ahead bright with possibility. But the real celebration was subtler, harder to document in press releases or annual reports. It lived in Henry's capacity to wake each morning with anticipation rather than dread, in his recognition that wealth was a tool for multiplication of love rather than insulation from loss, in his understanding that healing wasn't something that happened once, but a daily choice to remain open to wonder despite the reality of pain. On a crisp October evening, as autumn leaves painted Chicago's parks in shades of gold and crimson, and the lake took on the silvered beauty that accompanied the city's transition into winter, Henry stood once again on his mansion's terrace. But this time, he wasn't alone with grief and memory. Rosa and Mateo were with him, along with several other families whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work. All of them gathered to celebrate the season and the unexpected community that had grown from one boy's simple acts of kindness. Children's voices filled the mansion's rooms, their laughter echoing off walls that had been silent for too long. Adults mingled in easy conversation, sharing stories and dreams and practical wisdom gained through experience of struggle and survival. The dinner table that had stood empty for years now groaned under the weight of dishes prepared by many hands, representing culinary traditions from around the world brought together in celebration of the diversity that made their shared community strong. As the evening progressed and guests began to gather their children for the journey home, Matteo approached Henry with a folded piece of paper in his hands. It was clearly one of his drawings, created with the same careful attention and vibrant colors that had characterized his artwork since Henry had first encountered his work in Emma's former playroom. "I made this for you," the boy said, offering the drawing with the shy pride that accompanied his gifts. "It's a picture of all of us, but not just how we look now. It shows how I see us in God's eyes." Henry unfolded the paper carefully, his breath catching as he absorbed what the boy had created. The drawing showed his mansion, but not as the cold architectural monument it had once been. In Matteo's vision, the house was surrounded by gardens where children played, while adults watched with loving attention. Light streamed from every window, and smoke curled cheerfully from the chimney. But the most remarkable detail was in the sky above the house, where Matteo had drawn two figures watching the scene below with expressions of pure joy. They were clearly meant to be Sarah and Emma, recognizable despite the limitations of crayon portraiture, their faces radiant with approval for the transformation that love had worked in the space where they had once lived. At the bottom of the page, in Matteo's careful lettering, were the words, "Family isn't just about blood. It's about love that chooses to grow even when it seems impossible." Henry stared at the drawing for a long moment, feeling the truth of those words settle into his heart, like seed taking root in prepared soil. This boy had somehow captured not just what their friendship had become, but what it had taught him about the nature of love itself, that it wasn't diminished by loss, but transformed by it, not ended by death, but expanded beyond the boundaries of individual life into something larger and more enduring. "Thank you," Henry whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "This is the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me." Matteo smiled, the expression transforming his face into something that seemed to carry light within itself. "That's how love works," he said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that continued to astonish Henry. "When you give it away, it comes back bigger than when it started." As Henry tucked the drawing carefully into his jacket pocket, he realized that this child had just articulated the central truth of their entire journey together. Love given freely and without expectation of return had indeed come back bigger than either of them could have imagined, not just in the transformed circumstances of their individual lives, but in the expanding circle of people whose lives had been touched by their friendship. The foundation would continue to grow, serving more families and creating more opportunities for healing and hope. Rosa would graduate and begin her nursing career, bringing her particular gift for compassionate care to patients who needed both medical expertise and human understanding. Matteo would continue his education, supported by resources that would allow him to pursue any dream his remarkable heart could conceive. But beyond these individual successes lay something more profound, the recognition that love, once unleashed from the constraints of fear and self-protection, possessed a generative power that could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. What had begun as one man's grief and one boy's simple kindness had become a force for healing that touched hundreds of lives and would continue expanding in ways neither of them could predict or control. Years have passed since that gray October afternoon when Henry Caldwell first watched a small boy protect babies in the rain with nothing but cardboard and compassion. The foundation that grew from their friendship has become one of Chicago's most effective community organizations, touching thousands of lives through programs that address everything from educational support to emergency health care to job training for adults seeking better futures for their families. Rosa completed her nursing degree and now works at the same hospital where Matteo once fought for his life, bringing to her patients the same fierce protective love that guided her parenting. She's become a leader in the Foundation's healthcare initiatives, ensuring that medical services reach families who might otherwise fall through the cracks of an overburdened system. Matteo himself is now 17, a senior in high school who has received full scholarship offers from several prestigious universities. His childhood gift for healing presence has developed into plans for a career in pediatric medicine, though he continues to volunteer at children's hospitals throughout the city, still carrying the same gentle wisdom that first captured Henry's attention all those years ago. But perhaps the most significant transformation belongs to Henry himself. The man who once lived surrounded by stopped clocks and sealed memories now inhabits time with grateful attention to each moment's possibilities. His mansion, once a mausoleum of grief, has become a gathering place where love multiplies through shared meals, community meetings, and children's laughter. The fortune that once felt like a burden or a game has become a tool for healing that helps broken places become whole. On quiet mornings when Lake Michigan catches the early light like scattered diamonds and Chicago awakens to another day of possibility, Henry often stands on his terrace and thinks about the mystery of transformation. How does a heart that seems permanently frozen learn to beat with warmth again? How does despair give way to hope? How does one small boy's kindness become a force that changes not just individual lives but entire communities? The answers, he has learned, are both simple and profound. Love, freely given, creates more love. Kindness, offered without expectation of return, multiplies beyond the giver's capacity to track or contain it. And sometimes salvation comes not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through the patient accumulation of small acts of compassion that eventually grow into something large enough to transform the world. And you, have you ever met someone small who changed your life in an immense way? Perhaps a child whose wisdom surprised you, or whose generosity challenged everything you thought you knew about human nature. Maybe you've been that small person for someone else, offering comfort or hope at exactly the moment when it was needed most. These encounters aren't accidents, they're invitations, opportunities to discover that we're all connected by invisible threads of compassion, that healing is always possible when we open our hearts to unexpected teachers, that the divine often comes disguised as ordinary people doing extraordinary things with quiet grace. Tell me your story in the comments. Share the moment when someone unexpected taught you something essential about love, hope, or healing. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches another soul who needs to believe again that miracles still happen, that children still carry wisdom in their pockets, and that even the coldest winter eventually gives way to spring. Because in a world that often seems broken beyond repair, we need these reminders that love is still the most powerful force in the universe, capable of healing the deepest wounds, bridging the widest distances, and transforming even the most frozen heart into something warm and generous and infinitely capable of joy.